Hello, and welcome to the Quantum Slumber. I'm really glad you found your way here tonight. This little channel is meant to be a quiet corner of the internet, a place where big, strange ideas from physics and neuroscience slow down, soften, and drift gently into the kind of storytelling you can fall asleep to. Here, quantum mechanics doesn't shout through equations. It curls up beside you and speaks in a calm, late-night voice. But before you fully settle in, let me ask you something. What if your mind isn't just a pattern of electrical sparks trapped inside your skull? What if the feeling of being you, your thoughts, your memories, that steady sense of I am, is somehow connected to the same invisible fabric that shapes particles, stars, and galaxies? Some scientists think that might be exactly what's happening. Deep inside your brain cells, there are tiny hollow structures called microtubules. In most biology textbooks, they're just quiet support beams, holding neurons in shape and helping move things around. But a growing group of researchers believes that inside those little tubes, delicate quantum processes may be taking place. Processes that classical physics says shouldn't survive in the warm, wet chaos of the brain. If they're right, then your consciousness might not be purely classical at all. It might be quantum, subtly entangled with the deeper fields of reality, woven into the same underlying fabric that everything in the universe arises from. Right now, as you listen to these words, your awareness could be participating in the very rules that guide the cosmos. It's a strange idea. It can feel a little unsettling, but tonight, we're not here to debate it or rush through it. We're here to let that possibility sit beside us for a while, to explore it slowly and gently, in a way that your mind can wander through, even if you drift off before we reach the end. If you find comfort in these quiet, late-night explorations, where science and sleep meet in the soft middle, you're always welcome to gently tap the like button or subscribe so you can find your way back here on another restless night. And if you'd like, you can leave a comment telling me where in the world you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the universe. For now, though, you don't have to do anything at all. Just let your body sink a little deeper into whatever is holding you. Let your eyes grow a bit heavier, and let your thoughts loosen around this quiet possibility that your mind and the universe might be far more connected than you ever imagined. As you settle a little deeper into whatever is holding you tonight, we can gently turn our attention to a question that lives right at the center of all this talk about quantum mind and the universe. Not a question about particles or equations, but a quieter one. What is it exactly that it feels like to be you? Think just for a moment about the last time you saw a vivid red sunset. Not the wavelengths of light, not the physics of the sky, but the way that red actually appeared in your awareness. That soft, glowing presence in the mind's eye, or the warmth of sunlight on your skin on a chilly morning. Not the temperature on a thermometer, but that gentle comfort that seems to spread through your body and through your mood at the same time. Or maybe there's a memory you carry, a childhood room, a familiar smell, the sound of someone's voice, that brings a bittersweet pang of nostalgia whenever it drifts back in. Whatever the details are for you, there's something deeply personal, deeply felt about these moments. That felt quality is what philosophers and neuroscientists mean when they talk about conscious experience. Not just information being processed, but the way it feels from the inside to be aware of anything at all. One philosopher, David Chalmers, gave this puzzle a name that has stuck. He called it the hard problem of consciousness. He made a simple but very important distinction. On one side, there are what he called the easy problems. Easy doesn't mean trivial. They are complicated and require huge amounts of research. But in principle, we can see how to approach them. Questions like, how does the brain recognize faces? How does it store memories? How does it control movement, language, attention? These are problems about input and output, how signals come in through the senses, travel through networks of neurons, and result in behavior or internal representations. They're about the brain as a very advanced biological computer. But then there is the other side, the hard problem. Even if we knew everything about how information is processed in the brain, how neurons fire, how circuits are wired, there's still a question left hanging in the air. Why should any of that feel like something from the inside? You could, at least in theory, imagine a system that takes in light, identifies shapes, produces spoken words, behaves intelligently, and yet there is no one home inside. No inner movie, no inner voice, no sense of, I am experiencing this. Just inputs and outputs, with no experience accompanying them. That gap between what the brain does and what it feels like to be that brain is the heart of the hard problem. Classical neuroscience often starts from a very practical perspective. The brain is a 3-pound lump of tissue, an intricate network of about 86 billion neurons, each communicating with tiny electrical spikes and chemical signals. When you see something, a particular pattern of activity passes through visual areas. When you hear something, another pattern flows through auditory circuits. We can measure these patterns with electrodes, with brain scans, with all kinds of sophisticated tools. From the outside, it all looks like a storm of signals. But from the inside, it looks like colors and shapes and sounds and emotions and thoughts. It looks like an entire inner world. You can map every neuron in that storm, label every connection, track every firing pattern, and still be left with the same haunting question. Where in all of that is the experience? We can point at a brain scanner and say, here's the pattern that appears when you see red, but that doesn't explain why that pattern should come with the sensation of redness instead of silence. We can say, here is the network that lights up when you feel sad, but that doesn't tell us why those signals should be accompanied by the ache in the chest, the heaviness in the mind, the unmistakable feeling of sadness itself. Yes, Chalmers sometimes puts it this way. You can describe the brain from the outside in incredible detail, and you'll still be describing what he calls the easy problems, the functions, the behaviors, the mechanisms. The hard problem is bridging the gap between those descriptions and the first-person perspective. What it's like to be the system that's doing all of that. It's the difference between a neurologist watching waves of activity on a screen and you lying awake at night, replaying a conversation, feeling the emotions rise and fall inside your chest. The first is a third-person view of a physical system. The second is a first-person experience that seems to glow with its own light. Why does any physical system have a first-person side at all? Some scientists would say, give us time. Once we understand the brain's information processing completely, consciousness will fall out of the equations. Others are not so sure. They suspect that something is missing from our current picture, that the language of classical computation and classical physics may simply not be rich enough to explain why matter, at some level of complexity, wakes up. This is where the hard problem begins to gently push us toward deeper questions about the nature of reality itself. Because when you really sit with it, you start to notice just how strange everyday experience is. A cup of tea on your bedside table isn't just a physical object. In your awareness, it appears as color, warmth, smell, taste, the comfort of the habit, the memory of all the other nights you've done this before. Your brain is doing something far beyond simple input-output. It is weaving a world, moment by moment, and somehow that world is lit from within. You can tell a story about neural circuits that control attention, another about circuits that integrate sensory information, another about circuits that generate internal models of the body and the environment. All of that is valuable, but none of it captures the raw, undeniable fact that there is something it is like to be you, here, now, breathing, listening, drifting. That's the hard problem. It doesn't just touch vision and memory. It also quietly brushes against your sense of agency, that feeling that you were the one choosing what to think about, what to do next, which path to follow. From a purely classical perspective, every choice you make could, in principle, be traced back through a chain of causes: genetics, environment, brain states, neurons firing in accordance with physical laws. Yet, from the inside, Your choices don't feel like the inevitable output of a machine. They feel like something you do, something that arises from the mysterious center you call me. Whether that feeling of agency is an illusion or a hint that something deeper is going on inside the mind is one more thread woven into this hard problem. It's one more way in which your inner life doesn't quite fit neatly into the picture of a purely mechanical universe. For now, you don't need to solve any of this. You don't need to decide which theory is right. It's enough just to rest with the question, to notice how remarkable it is that there is an inner world at all, that there is a quiet, continuous stream of experience flowing through you as you lie here, listening in the dark. If you follow that question, why there is anything it feels like to be you, down to smaller and smaller scales, you eventually run into a place where the rules of the world start to change. Not because you've gone to another planet or another galaxy, but because you've gone so far inward that everyday intuition simply stops working. For a moment, picture an ordinary object in your room, a lamp, your phone, the glass of water by your bed. At this level, everything seems straightforward. Things have positions, shapes, colors. They stay where you put them unless something moves them. A cup is either on the table or it isn't. The light is either on or off. Classical physics is very good at describing that world. It treats objects as solid, well-defined things following predictable paths under clear forces. And for most of daily life, that's all we need. But if you slowly zoom down, past molecules, past atoms, down into the tiny building blocks that make up matter, the picture begins to shimmer. At those scales, in the realm we call quantum mechanics, particles do not behave like tiny billiard balls. They act more like waves of possibility. Instead of being here or there, a quantum particle can exist in a mixture of states at once. A single electron can behave as if it's in multiple places, or spinning in multiple directions, all at the same time. Physicists call this strange behavior superposition. It's as if reality keeps its options open. Only when we measure the system, when we look, probe, or interact with it in a definite way, does that cloud of possibilities resolve into one concrete outcome. Here, not there, this value, not that one. Even stranger, particles can become linked in ways that don't fit our usual ideas of separation. Two particles can be prepared so that what happens to one is instantly connected to what happens to the other, no matter how far apart they are. Change one, and the other knows immediately. This is entanglement, the phenomenon Einstein once dismissed as spooky action at a distance. It doesn't mean information is traveling faster than light in the usual sense. But it does mean that, at the deepest level we know how to describe, the universe doesn't split neatly into independent parts. Things that look separate in space can still be part of a single, shared quantum state. There's also tunneling, where a particle slips through a barrier it shouldn't be able to cross if it were simply a little ball rolling around. Instead of climbing over the wall, it appears on the other side as if the wall weren't fully solid at all, but more like a fog of possibility the particle can blur through. For a long time, physicists assumed all of this, superposition, entanglement, tunneling, was confined to a very special, very fragile domain. To see these effects, you usually have to cool systems to temperatures near absolute zero, isolate them from their environment, and shield them from almost any disturbance. That's why the idea of quantum effects inside the brain seemed ridiculous at first glance. Your head is warm, wet, noisy. Neurons are constantly firing. Ions are rushing in and out. Chemical reactions are happening everywhere. It looks like the last place delicate quantum states could survive. And yet, nature has a way of slipping quantum behavior into places we didn't expect. When scientists began to examine living systems more closely, they started to find hints that life itself might be quietly using quantum mechanics, not in rare, artificial conditions, but at ordinary temperatures, in messy biological environments. One of the first big clues came from something very gentle and familiar: sunlight falling on leaves. Photosynthesis, the process by which plants and some bacteria turn light into usable energy, is incredibly efficient. When a photon of sunlight is absorbed, the energy needs to travel through a complex maze of molecules to reach the reaction center, where it can be stored and used. Classically, you'd expect that energy to hop randomly, like a person feeling their way through a dark room, bumping into obstacles and losing efficiency. Instead, experiments suggest that the energy moves as if it explores many paths at once in a quantum superposition, then chooses the most efficient route. It's as though the system uses quantum mechanics to run a quiet search through all possible options simultaneously, settling on the path that wastes the least. Another clue comes from creatures that move through the world with a kind of built-in compass. Many birds seem to navigate using Earth's magnetic field. For decades, we didn't know how they managed it. Their brains are too small for a full-blown classical sensor system that constantly calculates magnetic forces the way a machine might. But studies suggest that certain proteins in their eyes may host entangled particles. When light hits these molecules, paired electrons become entangled, and tiny changes in Earth's magnetic field subtly influence how that entangled state evolves. The bird's visual system may then interpret those changes as information about direction, a quantum compass quietly guiding long migrations. There are even proposals that something as seemingly simple as smell might involve quantum effects. One idea is that when odor molecules bind to receptors in your nose, what matters isn't just shape, but whether electrons can tunnel through specific parts of the molecule. If they can, the receptor responds differently, giving each scent a kind of quantum signature. None of this means that every aspect of life is quantum in some mystical sense. But it does show that biological systems can, under the right conditions, harness superposition, entanglement, and tunneling even at room temperature in warm, wet environments. The sort of environments we once thought were fatal to quantum coherence. And that starts to make a very different picture possible. If plants can use quantum superposition to move energy efficiently, if birds can use entangled particles to sense a magnetic field, if even simple sensory processes might rely, at least in part, on quantum tunneling, then perhaps the brain, this extraordinarily complex organ that builds your inner world, might also have found ways to work with quantum effects. Not everywhere, not in every process, but in the right microstructures, in the right protected pockets, at the right times. That idea doesn't solve any mysteries on its own, but it opens a door. Instead of thinking of the brain purely as a classical machine, built out of neurons firing like little switches, we can at least imagine a more delicate picture. One where some of its most interesting properties might emerge from an interplay between the everyday world of signals and spikes and the deeper, stranger layer of quantum possibilities humming beneath. Later tonight, we'll slip further into that picture and look more closely at those tiny structures inside your neurons that some researchers believe could be hosting quantum events. For now, it's enough just to know that the universe's strangest rules are not confined to distant labs and exotic experiments. They may already be woven quietly into the fabric of life, into the way a leaf catches light, the way a bird finds its way home, and perhaps, in some still mysterious way, into the way your own mind takes shape moment by moment as you drift through the soft edges of awareness. By now, we've taken a quiet walk through the strange rules that govern the quantum world and seen how nature sometimes sneaks those rules into living systems. All of that sets the stage for one of the boldest ideas in modern science. And it begins with an unlikely partnership. On one side, you have Sir Roger Penrose, a mathematical physicist, comfortable working at the edge of general relativity and black holes, more at home with abstract geometry than with brain tissue. On the other side, you have Stuart Hameroff, an anesthesiologist, someone whose daily work was putting people to sleep for surgery and watching consciousness disappear and return. Their worlds couldn't have been more different. Penrose approached reality through elegant equations and deep questions about the nature of space and time. Hameroff approached it through the fragile, practical business of keeping people alive while their awareness vanished under anesthesia. And yet, both were haunted by the same feeling, that our standard classical picture of the brain just didn't quite touch the heart of conscious experience. Penrose had long been skeptical that consciousness could be explained as a purely classical computation, like a very complicated but essentially mechanical algorithm running on neurons. He suspected that something in the mind might be tapping into deeper levels of physics, levels where quantum gravity and the structure of space-time itself become important. Hameroff, meanwhile, spent years watching a single syringe of anesthetic erase a patient's entire inner world. He knew that these drugs didn't simply switch off neurons as if flipping a simple on-off switch. They altered something more subtle in the brain. And he couldn't shake the question, what exactly are they doing to the physical substrate of consciousness? When the two finally connected, their questions intertwined into a single, audacious proposal. They suggested that consciousness might not be emerging from large-scale networks of neurons firing in classical patterns, as most neuroscientists assume. Instead, they proposed that quantum processes deep inside neurons could be the real stage on which conscious moments appear. They called their theory orchestrated objective reduction, often shortened to ORCH-OR. The basic picture goes like this. Inside each of your neurons is a delicate internal skeleton made of tiny, hollow protein tubes called microtubules. Under a microscope, they look like intricate lattices, long cylinders built from repeating protein subunits called tubulin. In the standard biology story, microtubules are like scaffolding and railway tracks. They help give cells their shape. They guide the transport of molecules from one part of the cell to another. They organize the internal architecture needed for neurons to function. Penrose and Hameroff didn't dispute any of that, but they suggested that microtubules might be doing something in addition to their structural job. They proposed that the tubulin proteins inside microtubules could exist in quantum superposition, like tiny switches that are simultaneously in multiple states at once. The pattern of these quantum states, spread throughout a network of microtubules, could form something like a quantum computer inside the neuron. These quantum states would evolve according to the usual rules of quantum mechanics, until they reached a certain threshold defined by the geometry of space-time itself. At that point, according to Penrose's ideas about quantum gravity, the superposition would become unstable and undergo what he called objective reduction, a kind of spontaneous collapse that doesn't depend on an external observer. When that collapse happens, the microtubule system chooses one of many possible configurations, and that event, a single discrete reduction of a quantum state, is proposed to correspond to a moment of conscious experience. Not a vague field, not a fuzzy process, but a crisp, tiny tick of awareness. Orchestrated refers to the idea that these collapses aren't random little flashes happening in isolation. Instead, microtubules inside many neurons could become entangled and coordinated, so that large regions of the brain participate in a unified quantum event. The brain's classical activity, all those spikes and synapses, would help tune and align these quantum states, setting up the conditions under which objective reduction occurs. From this perspective, the brain is not just a classical network of neurons. It's a hybrid system in which classical neural firing and underlying quantum processes in microtubules are deeply intertwined. Each orchestrated collapse would be like a frame in a cosmic movie, occurring perhaps dozens of times per second, giving rise to the continuous flowing stream of consciousness you experience as you. It's a beautiful picture. It suggests that your awareness is not just riding on top of everyday physics, but may be directly linked to the deepest structure of reality, the point where quantum possibilities meet the curvature of space-time itself. Of course, when Penrose and Hameroff first put this forward in the 1990s, the reaction from much of the scientific community was skeptical, to put it gently. Critics argued that the brain is far too messy a place for quantum coherence to survive. Quantum states are notoriously fragile. They tend to decohere, to collapse into classical outcomes whenever they interact with their environment. And the inside of a neuron is nothing if not crowded and busy, warm, wet, full of ions and molecules constantly crashing into each other. One influential argument suggested that any quantum superposition in a microtubule would decohere in a tiny fraction of a second, far too quickly to play any meaningful role in consciousness. From that point of view, OR sounded more like poetic speculation than solid science. Beautiful, yes, but unrealistic. And yet, Penrose and Hameroff held on to the idea for a simple reason. If classical physics alone can't explain why there is something it is like to be a conscious system, maybe we really do have to look beyond the classical picture. Their theory made testable predictions. It implied that microtubules should be capable of sustaining quantum coherence longer than expected. It hinted that anesthetics should act directly on microtubules, disrupting not just neural firing, but the quantum processes within these tiny structures. It suggested that we might be able to detect subtle quantum signatures in the way neurons behave. For many years, these predictions hovered at the edge of what experiments could test. But slowly, as techniques improved, researchers started probing microtubules more carefully. They shined light through them, watched how they handled vibrations and electrical fields, explored how anesthetic molecules interacted with their proteins. Piece by piece, a new picture began to form, one in which microtubules might not be as simple or as classically mechanical as they once appeared. Whether OR turns out to be exactly right, partly right, or simply a stepping stone towards some deeper understanding, it has done something important. It has focused attention on the brain's tiny quantum stage, on the possibility that consciousness might emerge not just from the firing of neurons we can see on a brain scan, but from the quiet, hidden dance of quantum states unfolding deep inside the cells themselves. And as soon as you consider that possibility, a natural question follows. Can we actually find evidence that microtubules behave in a quantum way inside living brains? That's where the story gently turns from theory to experiment, from speculation to data, and where the mystery of consciousness begins to intersect with anesthesia, brain scans, and some very surprising measurements. If all of this stayed at the level of theory, it would be interesting, but easy to ignore. A graceful idea, filed away next to science fiction. What changed the mood was when people began to go looking for evidence. If microtubules are really playing host to quantum processes in the brain, then we shouldn't just see them as passive scaffolding. They should show signs of quantum behavior in the lab, even outside of living neurons. So researchers started to probe them in more detail, sometimes with tools that feel almost absurdly gentle. A beam of light, a faint vibration, a tiny electrical pulse. At the University of Alberta, scientists took isolated microtubules and shined carefully tuned light through them. They weren't just interested in how the light passed, but in how the microtubules responded, whether they behaved like ordinary classical structures or like systems capable of supporting coherent quantum vibrations. What they saw was surprising. Instead of decohering almost instantly, as many critics had predicted, the microtubules seemed to sustain organized wave-like behavior for timescales that were significantly longer than classical estimates allowed. In quantum terms, we'd say they maintained coherence, a delicate alignment of phase, a kind of internal in-step motion, for nanoseconds at body-like temperatures. A nanosecond may not sound like much. It's a billionth of a second. But in the quantum world, where many processes unfold on far shorter time scales, a nanosecond is not trivial. It's enough time for meaningful interactions to occur, enough time for information to be processed, enough time for microscopic events to influence larger scale dynamics. Those early results didn't prove quantum consciousness, of course, but they did something important. They cracked open the door. They showed that microtubules were not as fragile, not as purely classical as the harshest critics had assumed. Then came more work from other groups. At the University of Central Florida, researchers explored how microtubules behave under different conditions, looking at their electrical properties, their vibrational modes, and the ways they might support long-lived, organized oscillations. Some studies suggested that under the right circumstances, microtubules could maintain quantum-like states for even longer intervals, potentially up to fractions of a second. If those findings hold up, that would be enough time for whatever is happening inside microtubules to influence the firing of neurons, the timing of networks, the rhythms of the brain. Again, none of this is a smoking gun. Each experiment has to be replicated, refined, challenged, but taken together, they whisper a quiet message. Microtubules are more than simple beams and tubes. They may have rich internal dynamics, and some of those dynamics may live uncomfortably close to the quantum edge. Still, there's a difference between saying this structure can support quantum coherence in a dish and saying this has something to do with consciousness. The leap from protein vibrations to your experience of being awake is enormous. That's where another line of evidence comes in, from a place that might feel close to home for anyone who's ever gone under the bright lights of an operating room. When you are placed under general anesthesia, something astonishing happens. In the span of a few breaths, the entire inner world you carry, thoughts, sensations, worries, the ticking of time, simply vanishes. Your brain continues to function in many ways. Heart rate is regulated. Reflexes may still exist. The machinery of life keeps running. But the light of awareness goes out. Anesthesiologists have long known which drugs can reliably cause this disappearance of consciousness, and in what doses. Yet, for decades, the actual mechanism, how these molecules switch off awareness, remains strangely mysterious. They don't just turn off neurons the way pulling a plug turns off a lamp. Many neurons keep firing under anesthesia. Some brain regions remain active. The activity changes, yes, but the brain does not shut down like a computer unplugged from the wall. So where exactly are these drugs acting? For a long time, the best guesses focused on receptors at synapses, on how anesthetics change the way neurons communicate across gaps. That's certainly part of the story. But as researchers looked more closely, another pattern started to emerge. Some studies found that common anesthetic agents don't just interact with membrane receptors, they also show a remarkable affinity for microtubules. In experiments at places like Wellesley College and other research centers, scientists observed that anesthetic molecules bind directly to tubulin, the protein that builds microtubules. When they did, the quantum-like behavior those proteins could support seemed to be disrupted. And then came an especially intriguing result. When researchers gave animals drugs that stabilized microtubules, making their internal structure more rigid and resistant to change, something odd happened during anesthesia. The animals took longer to slip into unconsciousness. It was as if preserving the integrity of microtubules made it harder for the anesthetic to extinguish awareness. On the other hand, when anesthetics were free to bind and alter microtubules, consciousness faded more quickly and reliably. From a classical perspective, you might have expected anesthesia to correlate tightly with changes in synaptic firing patterns alone. If consciousness were purely about networks of neurons, then anything that strongly affected firing would be the main player. But these findings suggest that tampering with microtubules themselves, especially with whatever delicate processes they host, plays a key role in turning consciousness off. In the framework of Orchor, this makes a kind of quiet sense. If microtubules are indeed supporting quantum coherence that contributes to conscious moments, then anesthetics that disrupt that coherence would not just dampen neurons, they would interfere with the very substrate of awareness. Stabilizing microtubules against these disruptions would then make it harder to extinguish consciousness. Even if you don't fully buy the theory, the pattern is hard to ignore. Microtubules appear capable of sustaining quantum-like coherence longer than expected. Anesthetic drugs bind to microtubules and alter that behavior. When microtubules are protected or stabilized, it becomes more difficult to erase consciousness. It's still an emerging picture. Each piece has caveats and critics, but together they begin to trace the outline of a story in which quantum processes and microtubules are not just quirky side effects of biology, but intimately tied to whether there is someone home in a brain. You can imagine it this way. In the awake state, microtubules across vast networks of neurons might be humming with delicate coordinated activity, coherent vibrations, entangled states, patterns of quantum information dancing just beneath the surface of classical spikes. That quiet, hidden orchestra contributes to the unified, continuous sense of being aware. When anesthetic molecules flood the brain, they drift toward those microtubules, nestling into their structures, scrambling their subtle behavior. The orchestra falls out of tune, the coherence dissolves. The quantum patterns that might have stitched together your conscious field begin to unravel. From the outside, monitors show changes in brain waves and blood pressure. From the inside, there is nothing at all, just a gap in the story. One moment, you are counting backward. The next, you are waking up, as if time had been cut and spliced. Does that gap correspond to the temporary silencing of quantum processes in microtubules? We don't know for sure, but the idea that consciousness might have a quantum fingerprint, one that vanishes under anesthesia and reappears as you wake, is becoming less easy to dismiss. For now, you don't have to decide whether this view is correct. You don't have to choose a camp or pick a theory. It's enough to notice how strange it is that your entire inner world can be switched off by a handful of molecules, and to consider the possibility that those molecules might be acting at a level much deeper than classical neural circuitry, reaching down into the tiny, hollow tubes that form the hidden framework of your brain. Somewhere in that quiet, microscopic architecture, something may be happening that links the physics of the very small with the soft, continuous stream of experience you call being awake. If microtubules really are quietly hosting quantum activity inside your neurons, it isn't just a curious footnote in biology. It hints at a different way of understanding why your inner life feels the way it does. One of the deepest puzzles in neuroscience is sometimes called the binding problem. Right now, your brain is processing many different streams at once. The sound of this voice, the feel of the pillow or chair beneath you, the faint sense of your own breathing, maybe a soft glow of light behind your eyelids or somewhere in the room. Classically, we picture all of this as separate circuits working in parallel. One network processes sound, another handles touch, another keeps track of posture and balance, another monitors your internal organs. Each region has its own job, its own pattern of electrical activity, and yet, from the inside, it does not feel like a scatter of separate processes. It feels like one experience. The voice, the body, the subtle emotional tone of your mood, the drifting thoughts in the background, they all arrive together in a single, unified field of awareness. You don't experience hearing here and touch there as separate movies. They're braided into a single stream of me, here, now. How? Classical neuroscience can point to synchrony, to networks that fire in rhythm, to information that converges in certain hubs of the brain. Those are important pieces, but even if you map every connection and every spike, the question remains: what is binding all these different signals into one conscious moment? The quantum consciousness picture offers a different kind of answer. If microtubules inside many neurons can become quantum coherent and entangled with one another, then vast areas of your brain might, at certain times, share a single quantum state. Instead of millions of separate computations loosely coordinated by electrical timing, there could be fleeting moments where information is woven together in a genuinely unified pattern at the quantum level. In that view, a conscious moment isn't just a bunch of local activities happening at roughly the same time. It's a coherent quantum event, an orchestrated collapse that brings together details from many parts of the brain into a single, integrated frame of experience. That would make the unity of consciousness not just a metaphor, but a literal physical property, a spread-out, entangled state that collapses as one. It also offers a hint about something else: how your mind sometimes performs feats that seem to outpace straightforward classical computation. Quantum computers, the machines physicists are building in labs, don't work by marching through one possibility at a time the way a normal computer does. Instead, by using superposition and entanglement, they can explore many possibilities in parallel and let interference patterns pick out useful answers. If something like that is happening in a biological and very messy way, inside microtubules, then your brain might have access to kinds of information processing that are hard to match with classical models alone. It might help explain why you can make rapid, holistic decisions based on extremely complex inputs. Why, for example, you can walk into a room, sense the mood, recall memories, read faces, and adjust your behavior almost instantly without consciously crunching through each variable. It might also shed light on sudden insights, those moments when a problem you've been wrestling with for days suddenly clicks into place in a flash, as if some hidden part of you had quietly been exploring a landscape of possibilities and finally stumbled onto a path that works. From a quantum consciousness perspective, those flashes could be the visible tip of a deeper process, one where quantum computations and microtubules survey many potential patterns at once, and an orchestrated collapse selects one configuration that then rises into awareness as a clear idea, an image, a feeling of, this is it. Of course, this is speculative, but it offers a way to think about why human cognition sometimes feels less like a step-by-step calculation, and more like a series of whole, unified scenes rising and falling in the mind. And then there's a question that reaches into something even more personal: your sense of choice. In a purely classical universe, every event has a cause, and every cause has another cause behind it. If you could, in principle, know the exact state of the universe at one moment and all the laws of physics, you could, in theory, predict everything that comes next. In that picture, your decisions, what you eat, who you call, whether you keep listening to this or close your eyes and drift away, would all be the inevitable result of prior brain states, genetics, experiences, and external inputs. There's no room in strict classical determinism for anything like genuine freedom. The feeling of choosing would be real to you, but it would be a kind of theater performed by a machine that could never have done otherwise. On the other hand, if we add nothing but randomness, that doesn't help much either. If your choices were determined by coin flips inside your neurons, they wouldn't feel like your choices. They would just be noise. Quantum mechanics introduces something subtler. At the microscopic level, it tells us that outcomes are not fixed in advance, yet they are not purely random in a simple coin flip sense either. Before a quantum state collapses, multiple possibilities coexist in superposition. The actual outcome emerges at the moment of reduction, a point where the wave of possibilities gives way to one concrete reality. In the OR framework, those collapses are not entirely computable by classical means. Penrose has argued that objective reduction events involve factors rooted in the fine structure of space-time itself, beyond any algorithmic simulation. Some researchers have suggested that free will might live in that narrow, mysterious space between rigid determinism and blind randomness. In the moments where quantum states in the brain reduce in ways that are influenced by, but not fully dictated by, prior classical conditions. On this view, your conscious intentions, your long-term values, your sense of self, might shape the conditions under which these quantum events occur. Through the patterns of neural firing that prepare microtubules, through the networks that orchestrate the timing and structure of collapses. The exact outcome of each reduction isn't fixed in advance, nor is it just noise. It emerges from a deep interplay between quantum potential and the organized living system that is your brain. That's a subtle idea, and it remains controversial. It doesn't give us a neat formula for how you steer quantum events. It doesn't magically solve all the philosophical puzzles about responsibility and agency. But it does offer a way to think about why your choices might feel both meaningful and open-ended, not fully scripted, not purely random, but arising from a level of reality where the future genuinely isn't locked in yet. When you stand at a crossroads in your life, when you pause and sense that you could go one way or another, that feeling might not just be a story your brain tells itself. It might reflect something real about the structure of the world, that in those moments there are multiple possible futures, and which one becomes actual depends in part on how consciousness participates in the unfolding of events. These possibilities are more than just abstract puzzles in philosophy classes. They touch questions most people quietly carry, especially in the still hours of the night. What exactly is this I that is aware of thoughts and feelings? Why do my experiences feel unified when my brain is made of billions of parts? Are my choices truly mine, or am I just watching a script play out? Quantum consciousness doesn't settle these questions, but it offers a different kind of language for them, one in which your awareness is not an accident of chemistry, but a phenomenon rooted in the same strange rules that govern the foundations of reality. For some, that is an unsettling thought. For others, it is quietly comforting. The idea that your mind might be more than a passive passenger in a mechanical universe, that it could, in some small, delicate way, be part of the creative fabric from which reality itself is continuously being woven. For all its elegance, this picture of quantum mind is far from universally embraced. In fact, if you slipped quietly into most neuroscience departments and asked about OR, you'd hear a very different tone. Many researchers would tell you that, as far as they can see, classical brain science is doing just fine. From their perspective, the last few decades have been a story of steady, practical progress. Brain imaging techniques have gotten sharper. We can watch networks light up as people see, remember, decide, and dream. We can map the circuits involved in vision, language, motor control, emotion. We can build detailed computational models that reproduce aspects of perception and behavior. To them, consciousness, while still mysterious, looks like something that might eventually be explained in terms of complex, but purely classical interactions among neurons. Billions of cells, trillions of synapses, richly interconnected networks doing information processing at a massive scale. Why bring quantum mechanics into that? The most common objection begins with the environment inside your head. The brain, critics point out, is warm, wet, and noisy. Quantum states are famously fragile. They decohere easily when they interact with their surroundings. It's hard enough to keep quantum coherence going for long in ultra-cold, carefully isolated lab systems. Expecting it to survive in a biological soup at body temperature can sound, to some ears, like wishful thinking. When Penrose and Hameroff first proposed OR, some calculations suggested that any quantum superposition in microtubules would collapse so quickly, in unimaginably small fractions of a second, that it couldn't plausibly support the timing and complexity of consciousness. These arguments framed the brain as the worst possible place to look for sustained quantum effects. Even as experiments have chipped away at those early estimates, showing that microtubules might maintain coherence longer than expected, many scientists remain unconvinced. They'll say, yes, maybe there are quantum features in biology, photosynthesis, bird navigation. That's interesting, but it doesn't mean consciousness itself is quantum. You can't just jump from quantum biology to quantum mind. They also point to the success of artificial intelligence as a kind of counterexample. Classical neural networks, the kind that run on ordinary computer chips, have gotten remarkably good at things we once thought required something like human understanding. They can recognize images, translate languages, compose essays, write code, and carry on conversations that feel surprisingly natural. Systems like ChatGPT and other large language models are built entirely on classical computation. Layers of artificial neurons, matrix multiplications, pattern recognition on a vast scale. No microtubules, no quantum hardware, no delicate superpositions humming inside silicon. And yet, they can mimic many aspects of human cognition at a functional level. They don't have inner lives, as far as we can tell, but they can imitate reasoning, generate creative-seeming text, and respond in ways that feel coherent and context-aware. For skeptics, this is a powerful point. If classical systems can reproduce so much of what we associate with intelligence and thought, perhaps consciousness isn't as dependent on exotic physics as some quantum theories suggest. Maybe the hard problem will eventually yield to a more complete understanding of classical information processing in brains, combined with a better picture of how subjective experience fits into that. From this vantage, quantum consciousness can look like an unnecessary extra layer, an added complication that hasn't yet earned its keep. There's also a deeper concern. Even if we show that microtubules host quantum states, and even if we show those states influence neural activity, we still haven't bridged the gap between physics and subjective experience. We've just moved the mystery down a level. Instead of asking, how do classical neural networks produce consciousness? We'd be asking, how do quantum states and microtubules produce consciousness? The question of why any physical process feels like something from the inside would still be there, quietly watching us from the shadows. And hovering in the background is another layer of complication. Quantum mechanics itself is not fully understood. Physicists agree on how to use the equations. They can predict experimental outcomes with astonishing precision. But there is no single, universally accepted answer to what the equations mean at a fundamental level. Does the wave function collapse because of observation? Because of decoherence with the environment? Because of some objective process built into reality? Are there many worlds branching, or just one? Different interpretations tell very different stories, and none has closed the debate. So, when a theory of mind leans heavily on a particular vision of quantum collapse, as OR does, many physicists grow cautious. They'll say, we don't even agree on what measurement really is in quantum mechanics. So, tying consciousness too tightly to one proposed solution might be building on sand. All of this doesn't prove that quantum consciousness is wrong. It simply means that, in the eyes of many working scientists, the idea is still very much on trial. There are intriguing hints, suggestive experiments, and beautiful mathematics, but not yet the kind of decisive evidence that would rewrite textbooks. Even so, the possibility that consciousness might truly require quantum computation has interesting consequences for how we think about artificial minds. If awareness does emerge from quantum processes, from orchestrated collapses in systems with many entangled degrees of freedom, then purely classical AI, no matter how sophisticated, might never be genuinely conscious. It could simulate conversation, imitate emotion, generate art, and still remain an extraordinarily capable pattern machine with no inner light. In that case, the route to artificial consciousness, if such a thing is even possible, might run through quantum AI, systems built from qubits rather than classical bits, where superposition and entanglement are not just metaphors, but physical resources. Researchers in quantum computing are already building devices with dozens, hundreds, and eventually thousands of qubits. Some are beginning to explore quantum neural networks, architectures that, at least in theory, could process information in ways reminiscent of both brains and quantum systems. A few people quietly wonder, if a biological brain uses quantum computation to generate conscious moments, could an artificial quantum network someday do something similar? For now, that question is more philosophy than engineering. No one knows what kind of structure, dynamics, or complexity would be required for a quantum system to have anything like an inner life. And many scientists would argue that talking about conscious quantum computers is premature at best. Still, the idea hovers at the edges of the field, a reminder that the intersection of quantum mechanics and cognition may eventually reshape how we think about AI, not just as a tool, but as a potential new kind of mind. On a more grounded level, the quantum consciousness perspective has also begun to nudge researchers toward new ways of thinking about brain health and therapy. If consciousness, or at least certain aspects of brain function, really do depend on quantum coherence in microtubules, then disruptions in that coherence might underlie some neurological or psychiatric conditions. Some early work has explored whether diseases like Alzheimer's, depression, or other disorders might involve breakdowns in the subtle order of these tiny structures. There are even exploratory studies where a transcranial ultrasound or other forms of gentle stimulation are used to influence microtubule resonances, essentially to nudge their vibrational modes and see whether that has measurable effects on mood, cognition, or awareness. These ideas are very young, highly speculative, and nowhere near clinical practice. They may turn out to be blind alleys, but they illustrate how a quantum model of consciousness can inspire new experimental questions, new approaches to diagnosis and treatment that would never arise from a purely classical view. Through all of this, the experiments, the debates, the speculative applications, one theme is hard to miss: uncertainty. Quantum consciousness sits in a liminal space. It's not just wild metaphysics anymore. There are real laboratories probing microtubules, anesthesia, brain dynamics. At the same time, it isn't settled science. It lives in a region where data are suggestive but not decisive, where interpretations compete, and where our understanding of both mind and quantum physics is still evolving. For some people, that ambiguity is frustrating. It would be much more comfortable to have a clear answer. Either, yes, consciousness is fundamentally quantum, or no, it isn't. Classical neuroscience is enough, but the reality, at least for now, is softer than that. We are somewhere in between. The warm, slow story you've been listening to tonight is part of a much larger conversation, one that spans brain scans and particle accelerators, philosophy seminars, and hospital operating rooms. Whether quantum mechanics ultimately turns out to be the key to consciousness, or simply one piece of a larger puzzle, remains to be seen. The evidence so far is intriguing, sometimes beautiful, occasionally unsettling. What we can say, gently and honestly, is that the theory is suggestive, but far from settled. By now you've heard a lot of maybes. Maybe microtubules can host quantum states. Maybe those states matter for consciousness. Maybe our sense of choice lives, in part, on that strange border between determinism and quantum possibility. There's another layer to this story, though, one that reaches beyond the boundaries of any single brain. So far, we've mostly talked as if consciousness is something that happens inside your skull, a private light, generated by a complex piece of biology and contained neatly within it. That's the default picture most of us grow up with. There's you in here and the universe out there, and the two meet only through the senses. But many of the people who work at the edge of quantum mind research quietly entertain a different possibility. That consciousness might not be a local byproduct of brain activity at all, but a fundamental feature of reality itself. In this view, your brain doesn't create consciousness from scratch, any more than a radio station creates music from nothing. Instead, it tunes into and shapes a field of awareness that is already there, an underlying sea of potential experience woven into the fabric of the cosmos. The physicist David Bohm had a language for something like this. He spoke of an implicate order, a deep, hidden layer of reality where everything is already interconnected, and an explicate order, the everyday world we experience where things appear separate, located, distinct. For Bohm, both matter and mind could be seen as different unfoldings of that deeper, implicate level. If you mix that idea with a quantum consciousness perspective, a picture begins to form. Consciousness isn't a tiny candle flickering inside your brain. It's more like an ocean, and your individual mind is a wave on its surface. A temporary, beautifully structured pattern in something much larger and more continuous. It sounds poetic, maybe even mystical, but some researchers think there might be experimental hints pointing in that direction. Consider a very ordinary experience. You step into a room, and before anyone speaks, you can feel the mood. There's a weight to the atmosphere, or a lightness, or a quiet tension you can't quite explain. On paper, it's just faces and furniture and light. Yet, your body seems to read something in the space itself. Or think about those moments when you find yourself thinking of someone you haven't spoken to in months. And just as you mentally say their name, your phone lights up with a message or a call from them. Statistically, coincidences happen. Our brains are good at noticing hits and ignoring misses. Skeptics are right to remind us of that. Still, the sheer familiarity of these little moments has led some scientists to ask, very cautiously, could there be some kind of shared field of consciousness? One that allows minds to sync up in ways we don't yet fully understand? A few experiments have tried to peek in that direction. Using sensitive brain imaging and magnetic measurements, some research groups have reported synchronized patterns between people who are near each other, sometimes even when they're not directly communicating. The claim isn't that thoughts are being transmitted like radio messages. Rather, it's that there might be subtle correlations in their brain activity, as if their minds were gently slipping into a shared rhythm. These findings are preliminary and debated, but to those who favor a quantum view, they are consistent with the idea that consciousness might have non-local aspects, that some features of awareness are not strictly confined to a particular location in space. Then there's the work that zooms out even further, to a truly planetary scale. For over 2 decades, a project sometimes called the Global Consciousness Project has monitored networks of random number generators scattered around the world. These devices are supposed to produce meaningless strings of zeros and ones, uncorrelated and unpredictable. Yet, according to the researchers involved, during moments of intense shared human focus, major global events, tragedies, celebrations that capture the world's attention, these random streams sometimes show small but intriguing deviations from pure randomness, as if they became slightly more ordered when millions of minds were emotionally engaged at once. Mainstream science remains cautious about these claims. The effects are subtle, the statistics complex, and replication is challenging. Many physicists and psychologists remain unconvinced. But through the lens of quantum consciousness, such hints are not easily dismissed. If awareness has a non-local component, if minds can, in some sense, participate in a shared quantum field, then widespread, synchronized attention might leave faint fingerprints in physical systems, sensitive enough to pick them up. On the more controversial edges of this landscape, there are experiments in areas like remote viewing and precognition. At institutions like the Stanford Research Institute, researchers once asked participants to describe distant locations they had never seen, or to sketch targets that would be chosen randomly after their session was complete. In other studies, volunteers sat in labs while computers selected future images at random, and subtle physiological signals in the body were measured to see whether people reacted a moment before the image appeared. The results are disputed. Some analyses suggest small but statistically significant effects. Others argue that methodological flaws, publication biases, or simple chance can explain them. These topics sit far outside the comfort zone of conventional neuroscience. Still, if consciousness really is non-local, if it participates in quantum processes that are not strictly bound by classical space and time, then phenomena like remote viewing or precognition, while deeply controversial, might not be as impossible as they once seemed. To be clear, nothing here is settled. There is no consensus that global consciousness is real, no agreement that remote viewing works, no definitive proof that your thoughts can reach across space and time. The most careful researchers in this area use soft language, as might, could, suggests, hints. They present their work as invitations to look more closely, not as final answers. But even at this cautious level, a theme emerges. The more we study consciousness at the boundary between brain and cosmos, the harder it becomes to see it as a small, private event sealed inside one head. The evidence, scattered, debated, and incomplete as it is, keeps circling back to the idea that awareness might be more like a field than a point, more like a web than an isolated spark. If that's even partially true, it changes how we think about what it means to be you. Instead of a lonely observer staring out at a cold universe, You become a local expression of something much larger, a pattern of awareness in a vast, interconnected field. Your sense of self, your memories, your personal history are still precious and particular, but beneath that, there may be a layer of consciousness that is not quite so sharply bounded. The feeling of walking into a mood, the quiet pull of another person's presence, the strange unity people sometimes report in deep meditation. These might be glimpses, however fleeting and filtered, of a mind that doesn't stop at the edges of the skull. Whether these ideas prove right or wrong, they invite a softer way of holding your place in the cosmos, not as a separate fragment cut off from everything else, but as a wave moving through a much larger sea of awareness, briefly taking on the shape of your life, your story, your night lying here listening, before eventually flowing back into whatever it is that consciousness arises from in the first place. There's one question that tends to rise up quietly when people hear about quantum consciousness. It doesn't usually show up in lab reports or physics papers, but it lives in late-night conversations, and it might be sitting somewhere in the back of your mind right now. If consciousness really is tied to quantum processes, what happens to it when the brain stops working? Here, we have to be very careful. Physics can't tell us what happens to you in any personal spiritual sense, but it does say something interesting about information. According to our best theories, quantum information can't be destroyed. It can change form, it can spread out, it can become impossibly scrambled, but it doesn't simply vanish from the universe. In black holes, in particle interactions, in every quantum process we've studied, that principle quietly holds in the background. Some researchers have wondered, and it's important to stress that this is speculation, whether the quantum information woven into conscious states might follow a similar rule. When the brain dies and its classical activity fades, the ordinary patterns of electrical activity are gone. But the deeper quantum information that once participated in those conscious moments might not be annihilated. It might simply return to the field it came from, dissolve back into the larger quantum fabric of reality. From that angle, you can imagine something like a quantum afterlife, not a place with streets and houses, not a straightforward continuation of your everyday personality, but a gentler idea that the information that made your awareness possible is never completely lost, only redistributed into the wider universe. Is that really what happens? We don't know. No experiment today can follow a conscious quantum state past the edge of biological life. The most honest thing science can say is that quantum information in general is conserved, and some thinkers have taken that as an invitation to wonder, quietly, cautiously, about what that might mean for consciousness. If you've ever had the feeling at a funeral or in a quiet room full of memories that someone is still here in some subtle way, the quantum picture doesn't prove that feeling right. But it also doesn't insist that everything meaningful about a mind is wiped out the instant neurons stop firing. It leaves a little space open. While the question of what happens after life remains unresolved, we can also look at what happens within a life when consciousness shifts into unusual states. When people spend years practicing deep meditation, for example, they often report experiences that sound strikingly like the cosmic, interconnected picture we've been exploring. A soft dissolving of the sense of a hard, separate self, a feeling of being part of something larger, a quiet awareness that seems less confined, less narrow. Brain scans of long-term meditators show patterns that fit that story. Their neural activity can become more synchronized, more coherent across distant regions. Some researchers have suggested that if quantum processes are involved in consciousness, these practices might help stabilize or extend quantum coherence in the brain, allowing awareness to settle into a more unified, expansive mode. Again, that's a hypothesis, not a proven fact, but it fits an appealing picture that through simple, repeated acts of attention, returning to the breath, noticing thoughts and letting them go, the brain might gradually learn to tune its own underlying quantum activity into a clearer, more harmonious state. A similar kind of tuning seems to appear in controlled studies of certain psychedelic substances, like psilocybin or LSD, given carefully in medical or research settings. People who receive them often describe experiences of unity, of dissolving boundaries, a feeling merged with the universe or with a vast field of awareness. At the same time, their brain activity changes in distinctive ways. Networks that are usually separate begin to communicate more. Ordinary patterns of activity loosen. Some early work suggests that these states are associated with increased coherence and unusual synchrony, as if consciousness were temporarily shifting into a different mode of organization. From a quantum consciousness perspective, you can imagine both meditation and psychedelics, approached with great care and respect, as ways of retuning the dial of awareness. Most of the time, our minds are tuned narrowly, focused on everyday tasks, small worries, familiar habits of thought. But under certain conditions, that tuning might widen, letting consciousness resonate more strongly with whatever deeper field it arises from. It's a bit like listening to an old radio. Most of the time, you're locked onto one station, the channel of me, moving through the day, thinking, planning, remembering. Every so often, though, the dial drifts. Static gives way to a broader, stranger music, a sense of connection that doesn't fit neatly into ordinary language. Quantum consciousness doesn't claim to explain those experiences in full. It simply offers a framework where they make a certain kind of sense. Changes in how the brain's quantum processes are organized, altering which frequencies of the underlying field your awareness can pick up. None of this is something you have to believe. You don't need to accept the idea of a quantum afterlife, or non-local mind, or cosmic fields of awareness. The evidence is still emerging, the theories are evolving, and reasonable people disagree. For tonight, it may be enough just to hold the possibility gently, that your consciousness, in all its ordinary and extraordinary moments, might be part of a much larger pattern, that the quiet attention you give to your breath, your thoughts, your life, could be a way of tuning a very small, very delicate instrument into the wider song of the universe. All through this quiet hour together, we've been circling one deep idea, that your mind might be brushing up against the quantum fabric of reality itself. There's one more piece of that story we haven't really sat with yet, and it's the one that sits right at the heart of quantum mechanics, measurement. In the everyday world, measuring something feels simple. You look at a clock, and it tells you the time. You step on a scale, and it shows you a number. You check the weather, and there's a temperature on the screen. But in the quantum world, things are far stranger. Before a measurement, a particle doesn't have one definite position or one definite state. It lives in a superposition of possibilities, here and there, up and down, all at once, in a way that doesn't fit neatly into ordinary language. When a measurement happens, that hazy cloud of possibilities seems to collapse into one concrete outcome. The electron is here, the photon goes through this slit, the detector clicks in this channel, and not that one. What actually counts as a measurement, though, is one of the great puzzles of physics. Is it any interaction with the environment? A certain kind of amplification? Or does consciousness itself play a special role in turning quantum possibilities into definite reality? Most physicists are careful here. They'll tell you the equations work perfectly well without invoking minds, and they're right. But the fact remains, every time we test the quantum world, the actual outcome, the one we observe, the one that enters experience, seems to appear only at the moment of measurement. Now bring that strangeness back into your own awareness. Right now, as you listen, your brain is constantly flooded with quantum and classical possibilities. Light from the room, memories drifting in the background, sensations from your body, thoughts about tomorrow, echoes of moments long past. The vast majority of this never enters your conscious experience. It remains potential, unattended, unselected. What you do experience, these words, this mood, this soft sense of being here, feels like a narrow, continuous stream. From a quantum consciousness perspective, you could think of each moment of awareness as a kind of measurement, a point where countless possibilities are quietly collapsed into one definite experience. When you look at a color, your brain could, in principle, represent many different interpretations of that signal, yet you experience one particular shade. When you recall a memory, your past isn't a fixed, perfectly stored recording. It's more like a cloud of possible reconstructions your mind can make. The act of remembering may be less like retrieving a file, and more like performing a new measurement on a quantum system, selecting one version of the past from many that could have been brought into focus. Each time you notice something, decide something, feel something, your consciousness may be acting like a gentle filter on the quantum world, choosing which path becomes the story you actually live. If that picture is even partially true, then you are not just moving through a pre-written script. In a quiet, subtle way, you are participating in the creation of reality, moment by moment. Not in the sense that you can simply think a new universe into existence. The quantum field still sets the rules. Physics still constrains what's possible. But within those constraints, your awareness might help determine which possibilities become actualized in your corner of the cosmos. The universe offers a branching tree of quantum outcomes. Your conscious life traces one delicate path through it. And here you are, at the end of a long day, lying still while your brain navigates those branches in a softer, slower way. Thoughts rise and fade, feelings loosen their grip, the sharp edges of the day's worries begin to blur. If consciousness really does have a quantum fingerprint, then even now, as you let your attention grow quieter, your mind may be easing its hold on specific outcomes, allowing experience to become a little more fluid, a little more open. You don't have to do anything special. Just by being aware, you're already part of this ongoing dance between possibility and reality. So, as you settle in for sleep, you might gently hold this idea. Every moment of awareness, every breath you notice, every memory that surfaces and drifts away could be a tiny act of co-creation with the universe. Your mind is not separate from the world around you. It may be one of the ways the universe comes to know itself. Let your shoulders soften. Let your jaw unclench. Let your thoughts wander without pressure to solve or fix anything. You are a brief, luminous pattern in a much larger field, a quiet intersection of quantum possibilities, biology, and experience. For tonight, you don't need to understand the equations or settle the debates. It's enough to rest inside the simple, astonishing fact that you are aware at all. As your eyes grow heavier and your breathing slows, you can let the questions drift into the background. The universe will keep doing what it does. The quantum world will keep shimmering with possibilities. And you can allow yourself to slip gently towards sleep, carried by the soft mystery of a cosmos that, in some deep and subtle way, is meeting itself through your mind, one quiet, drowsy moment at a time.